I do want to take just a few minutes to acknowledge some very special people here. My parents, I have them here all the way from Pickens County, Alabama. My mother and father. I'm grateful for their support. Two of our children are here, Tristan and Titus. Titus lives in Memphis, drove all the way from Memphis to support his father. And our oldest son, Tristan, is here as well. My wife sends her regards. She is a little under the weather. She's tough, and for her not to be here says a lot about the severity of her illness. So she sends her regards. There are also very good friends and colleagues. My good friend Adam Mixon and his wife Adrian, who came from Birmingham here. I see my good friend Pastor Foster and so many others. Dr. Nash, it's so good to see you. I am really blessed to be a part of building bridges for racial reconciliation. Ever since Carol started with this idea, a dream, a vision, it has resonated with me. It has found harmony with my life's work. And what makes this work so special is not only the work, but the people to which you get to do it with. And so I'm just blessed and honored to be a small part of a very big, soon-to-be national, if not global, organization that's transforming individuals and communities. Lastly, I am honored to be a part of this panel of distinguished scholars and leaders, people who served our community well, some in which I've worked with and whose work and conversations have been very impactful in my life. I do want to acknowledge also all the staff that's here today and who've made this event possible. I have 30 minutes. I'm a Baptist preacher. And my son, Tristan, is keeping the time. So if I go over, blame him, not me. But I want to talk about prerequisites for racial reconciliation. Prerequisites to racial reconciliation. As a professor, I know all too well the importance of prerequisite courses, both in college and graduate studies. Prerequisites are the required and necessary courses a student must master before enrolling in an advanced required and necessary course. Prereqs, as they are sometimes called, are foundational. They are essential, basic, mandatory, and even vital. They are of the essence. Greek 1 must be taken before one takes Greek exposition. Algebra is essential before one takes trigonometry. General science is vital prior to taking biology. Basic electronics and electricity is essential before one undertakes heating and air technology. I have also observed what is true in the classroom regarding prerequisites is also true in life. One must crawl before one walks. One must walk before one runs. A learner's permit is essential to having a driver's license. Prerequisites. Dating is recommended before marriage, and financial literacy or some sign of credit worthiness is generally basic to home ownership. These are prerequisites. And if and when, and students of learning and life have tried, if and when one tries to engage the advanced courses before tackling the prerequisites, the results are often frustration, fatigue, and failure, and the order varies. For our purpose here today, racial reconciliation is an advanced course in which too many have enrolled without taking the necessary prerequisites, only to experience the disastrous results of frustration, fatigue, and failure. Maybe it's the appeal and attraction of the name racial reconciliation that has people thinking that they can engage and be successful, but maybe it's the almost idealistic and romantic outcomes. The outcome of beloved community, egalitarianism, equal access, harmony, brotherly love, and fairness that makes us often attempt to take this journey before we enlist in the prerequisites. Alas, perhaps it's the promising objectives, multiculturalism, reparations, forgiveness, healing, diversity, equity, and inclusions. Whatever the reason, we often think that we can put our hands to this exhausting, heartbreaking, demanding, humbling, and cross-bearing work without counting the cost. I suggest that we must be grounded in significant preparation if we are going to avoid the results of fatigue and failure and frustration that has damned so many racial reconciliations before. South Africa understood this. They understood that you cannot practice 45 years of apartheid and have over 3 million black South Africans forcefully removed from their home and land, and then just have coffee and conversation, build a multicultural church, and reconcile and go on like nothing ever happened. They understood the truth is a prerequisite for racial reconciliation. So in 1994, on the orders of Madiba, Nelson Mandela, the father of the nation, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was founded in order to hear the stories of the victims of apartheid, to hear the hurt, the pain, the oppression, to look in the faces of those who had been marginalized and disenfranchised, raped, and had their children killed, for the purpose of granting reparations and rehabilitation to his victims, and get this, forgiveness to his perpetrators. Prerequisites. Reconciliation is painful. It involves hard truths. It involves the admittance of wrongs, and sometimes wrongs that you didn't commit. But the crime was caused by those you love and by those who love you, who passed on the benefits of their egregious racial sins. Reconciliation involves a hard work of forgiveness, not quickly, not haphazardly, but a forgiveness that counts up the cost, that accepts the fact that everything that has been taken won't be recovered. Forgiveness, void of an apology. Forgiveness, coupled with the demands of justice. That's hard. Jonathan C. Augustine, a dear friend, frat brother, in his book entitled Call to Reconciliation, How the Church Can Model Justice, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, clearly distinguishes and defines reconciliation in 3 categories. He names salvific reconciliation, social reconciliation, and civil reconciliation. Now, as a Christian, unapologetically, I enthusiastically and unapologetically believe with the utmost respect and tolerance toward any other religion or non-religious person that salvific reconciliation is foundational and quintessential to racial reconciliation. One cannot be in right relationship with people until and unless one is in right relationship with their God. This salvific reconciliation is vertical. and it is the catalyst for the ethical and moral imperatives necessary to foster healthy and equitable human relationships. I am thoroughly convinced, as I write in my books, Sacred Anthropology and Social Crisis Preaching, that the fruit and even the proof of salvific reconciliation is played out in one's social attitudes, behaviors, and ethics. You cannot love the God who you cannot see and despise the humans that you do see. But Augustine's trajectory bends towards social and civil reconciliation. Social reconciliation moves towards a political ethic rooted in egalitarianism, or at least the right treatment of others. Social reconciliation is rooted in Pauline theology as it is expressed in Galatians 3:18 in Christ. There is no Jew or Gentile, slave or free. There is no male or female, which means everyone must be treated as equals. There is no such thing as inherently superior human beings. In other words, racism, classism, and sexism are wrong. We cannot be right about racism and wrong about gender equality. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We cannot be right on issues of ethnicity and race, but continue to treat women as second-class citizens in the church and society. Civil reconciliation is not necessarily Christian, it is not even necessarily religious, but it is rooted in a moral ethic that seeks governmental redress to remedy injustice. I'm sorry, apologies, and sincere regards are kind gestures, but even in a biblical sense, they do not adequately compensate for the years of plunder, disenfranchisement, and oppression caused by racial oppression and white supremacy. Gary Chapman, many of you may be familiar with his work, has written a book entitled The 5 Love Languages. However, he's written a follow-up to that book entitled The 5 Languages of Apology. Though this book is for couples, its principles are profoundly relevant for racial reconciliation. The 5 languages of apology work for any relationship, even social relationships, where there have been egregious crimes, hurt, transgressions, and harm. For example, the Southern Baptist Convention twice, not once but twice, apologized for their role in slavery. But the apology, if it was heard at all, did not scratch the surface of the black and brown communities still impacted by years of racial discrimination and the perpetuation of the teachings of racial superiority and its devastating economic, social, and political impact. But imagine if we took Gary Chapman's principles and applied them to racial reconciliation. Here they are. This is how you apologize. First, the first step is simply expressing regret. I'm sorry. The second step in apology is accepting one's responsibility. After the words I'm sorry, though it should be followed in just admitting I was wrong. The third step, or the third language, is genuinely repenting. I'll try not to do this again. Then the fourth step is requesting forgiveness. Will you please forgive me? But this last language, this last step, here is the step we often miss and omit both in our private relationship and especially reconciliation, and that step is making restitution, which asks the question, what can I do to make it right? One of my favorite quotes is by Victor Hugo, that 19th century romantic writer and politician, most notably known for The Hunchback of Notre Dame and Les Miserables. He said, where there is darkness, sins will be committed. The guilty one is not he who commits the sin, but he who causes the darkness. This quote speaks to the root cause of societal and communal dysfunctionality and abnormality. It also leads us to think afresh of where the burden of responsibility for correcting and reversing these society and communal dysfunctions lie. What are the other prerequisites? I'm glad you asked. First, if we're going to genuinely be engaged in the hard work of racial reconciliation, we must begin with understanding the roots of race and racism. Race is a powerful and compelling idea. But in reality, race is a myth, a social construct, an invention born of both sinister and sincerely malignant scholarship, often with scientific and theological underpinnings and support. In fact, most phenotypic variations occur within so-called racial groups. That means that if we pool all the African Americans in this room, there is a chance that we will have more different about us than we would perhaps the other group of pooled white Americans in this room. This could mean that a Norwegian could have more in common genetically with a South African than a neighboring Norwegian. There is no evidence that races have distinct unifying genetic identities. Thus, there is no biological evidence that should support the taxonomy of the grouping of people based on skin color no more than eye color, height, foot size, or the shape of one's ears. However, in the 18th century, perhaps before, colonialism and slavery served as economic justification to place Africans and Indians in groups we now know as races. To our disappointment, many of the individuals of the late 17th to early 19th century, individuals that we were told in school to idolize and celebrate, are responsible for the perpetuation of this false narrative concerning human origins, human difference, and the basic assumptions of anthropology. Zoologist and scientist Carl Linnaeus, a zoologist who was responsible for the taxonomy or grouping of plants and then animals, just thought it was a good idea to treat human beings the same. Politicians such as Thomas Jefferson, philosophers like David Hume and Immanuel Kant, preachers and theologians of the likes of James Henry Thornwell, and even artists, as it is recorded in David Bindman's latest book entitled Race is Everything, Art and Human Difference. He says even the caricatures created by artists and painters perpetuate the damning ideology of race and black inferiority. The curse of Ham theory, that teaching that in Genesis 9 that Africans are the progenitors of Ham, and since Noah cursed Canaan, the descendant of Ham, then all black people being of Canaanite ancestry were divinely assigned to servitude, hurt generations of black citizens. Another false teaching was the scientific theory that skull size defined intelligence. And since Europeans have larger skulls, this meant that their brains were larger and had greater capacity for intelligence. It puts a new spin on the sometimes damning insult calling someone big head. But if we are to engage in racial reconciliation, we must, at all costs, understand the roots of race and racism. But then we must unwrap the reach and ramifications of racism. Racial reconciliation is not coffee, conversation, and cuddles. We must reach far beyond and far deeper than coffee and conversation to reconcile. The repercussions of racism have generational impact. Reconciliation is much deeper than the feel-good of multicultural worship. It is much deeper than fishing trips or even friendships with someone of another ethnicity on the job. There is not enough coffee or conversation to atone for the horrors of white supremacy, both past and present. Racism has reach. Racism has powerful ramifications. Unfortunately, many of us cannot, or we refuse to what I call connect the dots. Most of us recall as children, one of our favorite pastimes, exercises was connecting the dots. You remember the pictures that you would get in a coloring book that had the dots? Well, the truth of the matter is you had to connect the dots before you could see a clear picture, or else they were just separate dots on a sheet of paper. You had to connect the dots, but then before a picture was realized, you had to connect the dots, and in order to color the picture, the dots had to be connected. But there's something more. You couldn't just start at any dot. It mattered where you started. The problem with racial reconciliation is we don't connect the dots. That's why some people cannot see the clear picture of the harm that racism has caused. That's why they cannot see why the Supreme Court's affirmative action decision a few weeks ago and their rejection of President Biden's student loan forgiveness plan was wrong, because they don't connect the dots, or either they start at the wrong dot. If you make learning and reading illegal for 250 years, then for another 150 years, you place a race of people in substantial substandard school facilities with secondhand, outdated books. The least you can do now is to ensure that those who are qualified, who come from that race of people, are adequately represented in institutions of higher learning. No one is asking for a favor, but only fairness. No one is playing the victim, although perhaps we should. Any other race of people would and should. But in spite of that, this race of people still produce doctors, lawyers, presidents, CEOs, scientists, plumbers, teachers, brick masons, engineers, and factory workers. Connect the dots of eras past with the plethora of problems in black and brown communities. Ta-Nehisi Coates, in that now still riveting article in The Atlantic, The Case for Reparations, said 250 years of slavery, 90 years of Jim Crow, 60 years of separate but equal, 35 years of racist housing policy. Until we reckon with our compounding moral debt, America will never be whole. We must unwrap the reach and ramification of racism, as it is a prerequisite to racial reconciliation. We cannot start with the dot of can't we just get along. There was an Associated Press study many years ago. Coates refers to this in that award-winning article in an investigation that included interviews with more than 1,000 people, an examination of tens of thousands of documents and public records, documented 107 land takings in 13 southern and border states. In those cases alone, 406 black landowners lost more than 24,000 acres of farm and timber land, plus 85 smaller properties, including stores and city lots. Today, virtually all of that land, valued at tens of millions of dollars, is owned by whites or corporations. Richard Rothstein's The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America, and Ta-Nehisi Coates' award-winning essay in The Atlantic, The Case for Reparations, tells more personal and sinister stories of how black families and communities were robbed of their wealth, future, and the security for their children. Now, if we want to see why crime is so rampant in some predominantly black and brown communities, connect the dots. Start with generational disenfranchisement. Connect it to the dot of segregation in public facilities, housing, and education. Redlining, the creation of ghettos, and you'll have a poverty trap that is not only hard or impossible to escape, but that in those crowded conditions with limited resources, people are placed in survival mode where violent crime is inevitable and constant. Connect the dots. While there are pull up your bootstraps kind of mentality, and there is no excuse for this, that crowd is on both sides of the political aisle and in every race. These theories are often untested because the Native Americans and the black experience is unique in America. In short, any other race of people under the same historical conditions will respond in similar manner. And at one time, I must admit, I was a part of that chorus that sang black on black crime, but I had no context because I said those words without an examination of the conditions in which that crime occurred. I too have said, look at me. I was poor. I didn't grow up rich. I didn't have a silver spoon in my mouth, and I didn't rob, and I didn't steal, and that's true. But for every Tyshawn Gardner, there are 20 more with a different story. Because racism crushes the masses. It sets its gaze on the masses of people to annihilate them where few escape, but the majority are left with the burden of trying to live day by day. I wish I had time to talk about prison statistics. How, as one scholar writes, the massive misdemeanor system, misdemeanors, fines, traps the innocent and makes America more unequal. I don't have time to speak of how the building of private prisons ensures that there will never, unless we do something, be fairness in the courts. I don't have time to speak of the effects of poverty and mental illness and how budget cuts to mental health services increases the likelihood of crime and family deterioration. I don't have time to talk about the reach and ramifications of racism and gerrymandering. We've seen it here in Alabama to weaken the political power of minoritized communities so that now they even are stripped of their power to vote representatives who would advocate for them. I don't have time to talk about the closing of hospitals and clinics in rural communities that makes it almost impossible with someone with a medical emergency to reach quality health care in time. I don't have time to talk about how the pandemic that we barely made it out of affected black and brown communities more adversely than other communities because citizens in those parts of urban communities and rural communities did not have access to testing, vaccinations, and other life-saving measures that could have rendered a different outcome. We must connect the dots. There is a movie on Hulu, spoiler alert, called Chevalier. It captures in cinematic expression the global reach of the tentacles of racism. The movie, based upon true events in the life of the African French Caribbean musical genius Joseph Bologna, Chevalier de St. George, is the son of a plantation owner and an enslaved woman. Having matriculated at a boarding school in Paris, he is proficient in writing, language, and poetry. He is a master of the sword, maestro of the bow. His musical prowess towers Mozart. He is gifted beyond measure. He is celebrated as a great violinist and is heralded as a true man of France. After being anointed Chevalier de St. George, he is ambitious, and he has his eye set on becoming director of the Paris Opera. There is only one problem. Although he is a true son of France, his skin is his sin. And he is told by the committee in charge, that they favor Christophe Gluck, despite everyone knowing that the Chevalier is the best, despite everyone knowing that he is by far the most talented, the most deserving, the most prepared, they select Gluck as director of the Paris Opera. Well, in a drunken stupor, the Chevalier crashes a banquet held in the honor of the Queen. In his drunkenness, he stumbles over to the Queen, and he whispers in her ear, he says, "You know that I am the best." To which coldly she replies, "I know, but it does not matter." Then and there, we see a true portrait of what racism is. It is not concerned with right and wrong. It is only concerned with the power to preserve an order that maintains white superiority, white supremacy, and dominance while maintaining the authority to control, exclude, limit, define, and crush any person or group who is a threat to that order. The lessons in the movie don't stop there. The Chevalier falls in love with Marie Josephine. She's a talented and beautiful opera singer. But even in France, love between a black man and a Parisian woman is forbidden. Then in one scene, the Chevalier corners Marie Josephine in a church, and he says to her passionately, pleading, "We can run, we can leave this place, we can go anywhere, we can be together in our own little deserted island." To which she says, "We cannot go anywhere. We will not be happy. We will not be a happy family. We will not be free, neither in England or anywhere." The tentacles of racism have global reach. There is no place this vile and dreaded spirit is prevented from its power to limit who a person loves, where a person can express their God-given right and ability to love and be loved. That was true in the 19th century as well as the 21st. Prerequisites to racial reconciliation. But in closing, if we are going to be reconcilers, you and I must undertake the responsibility of resistance and restoration. It is said that our founding father, George Washington, uttered these words or penned these words. Let it be told to the future world that in the depth of winter, when nothing but hope and virtue could survive, that the city and the country, alarmed at one common danger, came forth to meet it. Barack Obama, in his first inaugural address, said, America, let us remember these words. In the face of our common dangers, in the winter of our hardships, let us remember these timeless words. With hope and virtue, let us brave once more the icy currents and endure what storms may come. Let it be said by our children's children that when we were tested, we refused to let this journey end, that we did not turn our back, nor did we falter, nor did we, with our eyes fixed on the horizon of God's grace upon us, we carried forth that great gift of freedom and delivered it safely to future generations. My brothers and sisters here today, the responsibility of resistance and restoration belongs to all of us. It belongs to the son of the slave and the daughter of the slaveholder. It belongs to the great-grandson of those who fought and voted against the 13th Amendment, as well as the great-granddaughter of those who marched and even died to see that the 13th Amendment was passed. We must resist the lie of the black separatists as well as the deception of the white nationalists. We must resist in our homes, at the dinner table, in conversations with the sincere but narrow views of those who have nurtured us at their breasts and held our hands as we took our first steps. We must resist every racial lie on our jobs, even if it costs our careers. We must ensure that people of color and women have a seat at the table, have a clear path for hiring and promotion. We must resist in the church when people have the audacity to say that a woman cannot preach. Because, again, you can't be right on the race issue and wrong on the issues affecting women. We must resist with every nonviolent means at our disposal. We must resist in the classroom when teachers and administrators and board members refuse to teach the truth about history. We must resist in our city halls when the budgets reflect the bare minimum spending in our communities who are hurting the most. We must also resist hopelessness and fatalism. We must resist bitterness and hatred and the spirit of revenge. We must resist violence and harm. We must resist. Then we must take up the responsibility to build the beloved community. We must take up the responsibility to build bridges where there are only gaps and gulfs. We must take the responsibility to make this world a better place and to ensure that every man, every woman realizes, even in their spirit, that we are created equal, that we are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Thank you.